You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Michel Paradis. 10 years of French, right? Maybe come in handy. You never know.
That was good. Yeah, rolled R's and everything.
Mr. Paradis is the author of the book we are discussing today, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of an American Superpower. Mr. Paradis is a leading human rights lawyer, historian, and national security law scholar. I just had John and Turley on my podcast.
Yeah. GW.
Law things. He has appeared, and my son's in law school. So if he wants to come move in next to you, Jerry, I've got the Kramer for you. He has appeared on or written for PBS NewsHour, CBS, MSNBC, CNBC, C-SPAN, Netflix, NPR, The Atlantic, and it goes on. He is a fellow at the Center on National Security and the National Institute of Military Justice. He was awarded his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a Campion Scholar, and received his law degree from Fordham University School of Law in New York. So he's obviously not intelligent, not successful, not respected.
Now you sound like my mother.
He is all these things, and he is also a terrific author. The Light of Battle. The reviews are terrific, including from people like Richard Overy, who's in the top rank of military historians, along with David Kennedy and Wesley Clark. I'd love to have Wesley Clark on the podcast.
Great guy.
Mr. Paradis, thank you for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
My pleasure entirely. And I agree with all the compliments you gave to the people who said nice thing about my book.
And I have to say that I stumbled upon Michel's book and just reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm going to read your book. Come on the podcast." And he said yes. So this wasn't one of the instances where a publicist reached out, so I'm extra grateful for you if you accept my blind email.
Yeah, my pleasure entirely.
We are at the Leaders and Legends podcast fans of subheadings. Eisenhower, D-Day, I get in a book about Ike. But the last part, Birth of an American Superpower. How do you tie all those things together?
Sure. I think the most easiest way to maybe answer that is to imagine what would have happened had D-Day failed. So D-Day is the first really major Allied operation that is clearly at the initiative of the United States. The British had opposed what became Operation Overlord really from the very beginning of the war, from 1942, when the Americans just sat down and looked at a map and said, look, we can win the war against Hitler by crossing the English Channel and attacking Berlin. And the British had very different ideas. And some of the reasons they had those ideas were good, not the least being the Germans were a far more sophisticated, powerful military than I think even the United States understood at that time. Part of it was also just British military doctrine. The British did not like large-scale, high-risk land wars. The World War I had been the one major exception they had made to that sort of doctrinal policy, and look at the results. And there was a significant fear of massive casualties. But also, the Brits understood the British Empire, which made up a quarter of the world's population and landmass at that time, understood World War II very differently than the United States did, right? Britain had been at the international game a long time. They had been the preeminent empire, certainly on the seas and arguably the world for the previous 100 years, and understood that World War II, or at least understood World War II as a vitally important, but nevertheless one of many wars that the British Empire would have to fight in its history, and saw not only the risks inherent in World War II once the United States enters the war, saw the opportunities available as well, particularly in the Mediterranean, where they saw correctly that the Soviets were going to increasingly take over Eastern Europe, and the British wanted to essentially cut off the Soviet access to the Eastern Mediterranean and also expand the British Empire over North Africa and the Middle East. And that really was the character of the war in Europe and the Atlantic theater for its first 2 years, with the United States at every conference saying, when are we going to get to do the cross-channel invasion, and getting put off and put off. And it's only really at the Cairo conference in November of 1943 that America finally has essentially enough weight to demand that Operation Overlord be initiated at long last over Winston Churchill and really the British High Command's pretty clear objections. And so there was a compromise cut where the Allies continued to fight operations in the Mediterranean, but also would now finally launch the cross-channel invasion that we now think of as D-Day. And that was a huge risk, right? The United States had never really led a major military operation in the world. Had D-Day failed, the Allies would have had no choice but to fully commit to the British strategy in the Mediterranean, which would have prolonged the war in ways that are actually difficult to estimate, right? Would the Soviets, having seen the Allies fail so spectacularly, cut a separate peace with the Germans again, and essentially divided Europe, a fascist West and a communist East? Not for nothing, but 1944 was a presidential election year. And as we are in a presidential election year now, we know that presidents make all sorts of decisions with an eye on November. Had the D-Day invasion in June 1944 failed, would Roosevelt have even run for re-election? Would he have won re-election? I think it's easy to suspect that he might not have. And so the entire course of really what we think of as Western history, really United States history from 1944 on, turns in many ways on D-Day. And that leads then not simply to America and the Allies not being humiliated and embarrassed, but also to the United States being able to demonstrate its power as a world power, and a different kind of world power, because the United States, unlike the British Empire, was not a colonial power. Indeed, was anti-colonial in its orientation, and was very much committed to the idea of multilateralism. So operating through organizations that would become things like the United Nations or NATO, and pursuing self-determination for countries when in situations like World War II. So one of the sort of, I think, just indicative moments, it's not crucial, but it's an indicative moment, is after D-Day, Eisenhower keeps getting these reports on how much French territory has been conquered. And he sends a fairly stern memo down saying, in every future report, the word conquered will be replaced with liberated. Because he very much understood that the United States had to win the war on different terms than on which it was begun. And so why is D-Day sort of the birth of the American superpower? I think it's really the first time, it is the first time, where not only is the United States successful in projecting power abroad at a global scale, but it's successful in projecting power on behalf of its own ideals at a global scale, and successfully showing that this kind of coalition warfare that is driven by aspirations as opposed to national self-interest is actually feasible, and is not just pretty happy talk that we use in our war propaganda to make ourselves feel better.
You mentioned the Cairo conference in 43. We had I don't know if you've read the book, The Devils Will Get No Rest.
No, I haven't actually. That sounds.
You would very much enjoy it. It's all about the Cairo conference, and it's written by a fellow named James Conroy, who came on the podcast. He did a terrific job. The book is wonderful. But as you mentioned it, so let's go back to that, because I took some notes and I want to make sure I hit some of these points. Why does the Cairo conference stand out in the power dynamic studies between, and we're just going to leave everyone else out for a second, between the United States and the United Kingdom, because that's clearly the moment that the U.S. is feeling its oats,
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
lack of a
sure.
better term.
Yeah. I think a couple things happened at the Cairo conference. One is by November of 1943, the United States has actually been able to mobilize what FDR sort of aspirationally called at the beginning of the war the arsenal of democracy, right? So everyone knew, much like we think about China today, it's just this massive economy, right? It has this massive economic potential. And the same was true of the United States before World War II. But there was very little reason to think that the United States could actually mobilize that economy in its national interest the way that nation states in places like Europe did, right? The United States then as now is a mess, right? At the time, it was basically like 48 states with all their own little governments. It had a court system that protected private property most of all. It had gone, not for nothing, gone to war with itself 80 years earlier. And a lot of those political and geographical rifts were never fully healed, right? That's as long ago from today as World War II was to the Civil War. And the United States just hadn't proven that it could actually mobilize all of that economic potential. It's in its national self-interest. And by November of 1943, when the Cairo conference happened, it's clear that it can. It's now producing 7 times as many ships as the Great British Navy, I think 3 or 4 times as many airplanes, double the number of tanks. And not only is it able to produce all of that, it's developed a global logistics network that has moved 20 million tons of military material all around the world just in the previous year. And so what the Japanese called the sleeping giant before Pearl Harbor, all of a sudden is now not only stirring, but swinging its enormous limbs around the world. And the British, who had become quite accustomed to dictating, as I talked about before, dictating the terms of Allied strategy to that point, now we're in a position where they have to at least give the United States an equal seat at the table. There was this sort of terminology that got thrown around by people in the know, is like, who's the senior partner, who's the junior partner? Mm-hmm. And at the start of the war, everyone understood very clearly that the British, for all the reasons I said, were the senior partner, and the United States was just putting its cleats on. But by November, that's less clear. It's at least an equal partnership by November of 1943. And obviously, by the time of D-Day, those roles reverse. And the United States is able, in all sorts of economic and military ways, to start directing the course of Allied strategy as a senior partner. But it's November of 43 where that equality is uncomfortably on display, because you have these meetings between the highly confident British who don't think the Americans understand war or anything of what they're doing, and the Americans who think the British are crusty and self-interested in their own empire and not essentially giving due respect to the American contributions in the war, such that you end up having like fist fights, not literally fist fights, but I've never read the proceedings of an international summit where it literally people are on the verge of reaching across the table from each other and starting to deck one another. At one point, and this sort of is an infamous moment from the conference, but at one point, Churchill is talking about the need to commit Allied forces to the island of Rhodes, which is part of this Dodecanese archipelago in the Adriatic, pursuant again to these sort of grand visions of an Eastern Mediterranean dominance. And at one point, George Marshall, the American chief of staff, loses his patience and just bellows at Churchill, not one American soldier is going to die on that goddamn beach. And so it got hostile, right? It got ugly and uncomfortable. And that's what I think made Cairo as underappreciated as it is in terms of the Great War summits, right? We think of Yalta, we think of Potsdam, certainly people think of Casablanca. But Cairo is really where that relationship between the United States and Britain is really put to the test, because Britain is now having to encounter a potential rival and having to think about the United States not simply as its young cousin or former colony who has lots of good stuff that they can use to expand the British Empire. Is this a power that is going to rival Great Britain's strategic interests in the world?
Is it fair to say that the doctrine that President Franklin Roosevelt clinged to, if that's the right way to say it, for the entirety of the war, the demand and doctrine of unconditional surrender, is certainly on their minds as they plot this massive invasion. In other words, as opposed to World War One, when the Germans signed the armistice on November 11th. I don't think there was a single Allied soldier on their territory. That led to stab in the back, blame it on the Jews. Here comes Adolf Hitler. And Roosevelt, more than anyone, I think, was determined that the Germans are going to know that they were defeated and they're not going to have any more conspiracies. And we're going to completely change that country as they know it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was extremely controversial. It's easy to forget how controversial it was because we won. We got unconditional surrender, but no one thought that was wise. Certainly the British didn't. And many people even said it was illegal, that only there were op-eds throughout the war, essentially echoing British sort of government policy, but in newspapers, where they would basically say, look, the only other country that's demanding unconditional surrender is Germany. And so it's just not how wars are fought, right? We fight wars for a political conclusion. We aim to settle peace, right? Great Britain had been in one form or another at it for about 1,000 years at that point. They're not in it to fight a war to end all wars. They're in it to end this war and hopefully expand the empire's stability and size. Whereas Roosevelt really did see from, I think, certainly from the period of the Atlantic Charter, when people thought it was just pie in the sky, even just propaganda, right? Just BS. Saw the war as an opportunity not to necessarily expand American power as such, but to actually change the world, right? To leave a world after the war that hadn't the world after World War II that people like, for all his sort of complexity, Woodrow Wilson had promised World War I would yield a rules-based world in which countries operated through negotiations and economics and discussion and did not resort to war. And that had been shown to be a fantasy, frankly, after World War I. But Roosevelt saw the opportunity of, if you really just smashed the remnants of militarism, and he would frankly say even colonialism, and the British sort of just went a little deaf every time he said that if you smashed that system essentially of power for power's sake and reoriented the world around ideas like democracy, like human rights, like international cooperation and consensus and organization, that you could really yield a world that was, in some respects, in the image of the best parts of America, even at that time, that sort of followed the American ideals that were founded in things like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And you could make those global ideals so that you would make war no longer the politics by other means, but war became a kind of crime. And to some extent, he succeeded in that, right? That is the world we live in today, even though it's often honored only in the breach.
Your comments earlier about the United States industrial capacity reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, and that is during the previous war, the Great War, Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, said he likened America to a gigantic boiler. There's no limit to the amount of heat it can produce once lit. So the British knew what they were getting. Also, you think you have a situation where Roosevelt's, look, we've been over here twice in 25 years. We're not coming over again. And so we're not going to fight any half-baked war. The Treaty of Versailles was a joke. So many people denounced it. I think everyone but the French thought the Treaty of Versailles was awful in a lot of ways. The United States Senate didn't even ratify it, much to Wilson's chagrin. So I'm on team Ulysses S. Grant when it comes to unconditional surrender, and I'm on team Franklin Roosevelt when it comes to unconditional surrender. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, and we are talking with Michel Paradis. He has written a book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. I just mentioned Grant, the only person who I can think of who rose through the ranks from obscurity, from a middling place in life, Grant, and a middling sort of career, Eisenhower, is Eisenhower. Eisenhower went from like a lieutenant colonel to a 4-star general in 4 years. And then back then, before the war, it took 20 years for people to go from lieutenant to captain. What is it about Eisenhower that struck your attention and got the attention of people like George Marshall and others when they were looking for someone to lead this great crusade?
Yeah, why did Eisenhower succeed when there were a lot of other options, right? The army got pretty big pretty fast. I think a couple things ended up serving him really well. Some of which were just not his responsibility, but some of which very much were. Starting with the things that were under his control, I think the biggest thing was followership. It's a concept that's taught in the U.S. military even to this day as an important virtue, an important value that we tend not to think of it in ordinary life as a positive virtue, but in the military it is. And by followership, it doesn't just mean being a drone, right? A blindly obedient drone, but it means subordinating your own ideas even to those of your superior officer and understanding that your role as a subordinate, as a follower of a leader, is to take the leader's vision and implement it as best as you physically can. And Eisenhower understood that in an important way, almost like an athlete does, right? If you're a player on a football team, like you could have your own ideas about what play is best, but if you run your own plays and the team is going in one direction and you're going in another, right, that's disaster. And so I think Eisenhower had this capacity for a combination of like his own personality reasons, as well as just a certain kind of wisdom that he developed to look for great mentors and cultivate great mentors in his life so that he was able to learn from lots of different people by not pretending that he had any of the answers when he didn't. And I trace a lot of his mentors in the book, and he learned good and bad things from them, right? Everything from Fox Connor, who I think really rekindles Eisenhower's intellectual curiosity, to someone like Douglas MacArthur, who Eisenhower is certainly infatuated with when they first get to know each other, and he learns a kind of charismatic leadership from MacArthur, but also the pitfalls of becoming a megalomaniac, as MacArthur certainly did. And then with George Marshall himself. And why did George Marshall trust him? I think it's primarily because Eisenhower, understood that Marshall wanted someone who got the job done, who didn't hide behind uncertainty, right? Who absorbed that uncertainty for Marshall, right? So that when he would make decisions, he would have to just make the best decision he could, and then do everything he could to make sure that he wasn't being seen as taking credit for that decision, that he was being seen as the implementer of an idea, or of a plan, as opposed to some great charismatic general, like people like George Patton or people like Mark Wayne Clark, who was also really quite a prominent general at the time and whose star is somewhat faded today. But and so I think for Eisenhower, what was the key to his success? I think a big part of it was being trustworthy. And a lot of that had to do with subordinating his ego, even though he had a huge ego, right? You don't get to that kind of position without having a huge ego. But understanding that not letting his ego be his master, I think, was probably the strongest personality trait that let him be trusted by his superiors. And because he was also competent. Like I don't want to underestimate his actual just skills as a staff officer and as a planner, and ultimately as a general. But a lot of people there are a lot of skilled people in the world, and those people don't become Dwight Eisenhower. But I think in Eisenhower's case, it was a certain level of humility and understanding of every person has to play a role, particularly in an organization, in a military operation, and that committing to something that's much larger than yourself both enables your superiors to trust you with responsibility, but also inspires your subordinates to be the best that they can be. Because I think the worst thing oftentimes a leader can do is make it all about them and their own sort of charisma and their own prestige. And I think Douglas MacArthur was a cautionary tale for Eisenhower in that respect. And because you end up just surrounding yourself with yes men, and you don't get the information you need to make the really hard decisions that you're inevitably going to have to make as a leader.
It's fair to say that Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, in other words, running the show in Europe on behalf of not only the Americans, but the Allies, that his appointment was not a foregone conclusion. And you mentioned this in your book, and I've read it in several other books. Take just a minute or so and tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience why Eisenhower was chosen as opposed to his superior, General George Marshall. Once it was decided in the political level that the Supreme Commander had to be a Republican. Oops, had to be, which I guess is true in this point.
Which is true. It turns out
has to be an American.
Yeah, no, yeah. So it ultimately falls to FDR to make that call, and going into the Cairo conference, everyone's expecting it to be George Marshall, not the least being George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower, for that matter. The plan, the best as Eisenhower could tell, was that he would be shipped back to Washington to essentially take George Marshall's place on an acting basis. So he'd have to be the acting chief of staff in the Pentagon, a job that he did not want at all, right? Not only was it a desk job, it would essentially put him, quote unquote, in charge of George Marshall in the Atlantic and Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. And Eisenhower was smart enough to know that there was no one in the world who would ever who would treat him as the actual commander of either of those men. But FDR really does make a switch in time right as he's leaving the Cairo conference. And why does he pick Eisenhower? It's one of the great sort of mysteries of this period that I spent an inordinate time trying to understand. The top level rationale that FDR gave, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, is that Marshall really was the indispensable man of the Second World War, right? There was no one in the world who had Marshall's truly global understanding of army operations, indeed military operations, in not just the Mediterranean at that point, but the rest of Europe, in the Pacific, the supply lines, the political connections on Capitol Hill, all of that. So to lose Marshall at a critical period in the war, I think would have been, and Roosevelt said as much, it would have put the overall war effort in some jeopardy. But I think there's more to it than that as well. And I think part of it comes down to something we were talking about a little bit before, is that the Cairo conference became a shouting match precisely because America and Britain were, peers, true peers, really, for the first time. And the British were all of a sudden put on notice, if nothing else, that the United States could be a real danger to the long-term viability of the British Empire. And that's at a time when they're going to need to move about 1.5 million Americans into the home of the British Empire, onto the British Isles to stage the D-Day invasion. And that there was still a lot of just uncertainty about whether or not the D-Day operation could be pulled off successfully. Even the most optimistic planners were projecting something like 25% casualty losses in the first few days. The D-Day invasion was always understood to be a very low probability operation, low probability of full success. And that leading that operation would be as much a political operation as it would be a military one. And for all of Eisenhower's genuine skills and talents as a military operator, he was really a fantastic diplomat and politician, right? A uniquely capable one in that period. And one of the things I spend a lot of time in the book unpacking is how Roosevelt ended up seeing that in Eisenhower, because it wouldn't have been obvious, right? Eisenhower and Roosevelt don't know each other. They'd met a handful of times in their lives to that point, and Eisenhower had never particularly impressed Roosevelt in any of those interactions. But they end up, just as the Cairo conference is about to get underway, they end up spending a couple days together where Eisenhower and Roosevelt is able to see Ike. Right, not just General Eisenhower, but he's able to see Ike for the first time.
At one point, Marshall wants to give recommends, look, we need to give Eisenhower his fourth star, and Roosevelt says no.
Yeah, that's right. After in early 43, after the Casablanca conference, Eisenhower was floundering. No one's taking him seriously, in part because he's only a 3-star general, and the British are chock-a-block full of 4-star and even 5-star generals. And so Marshall says, hey, we need to up Eisenhower's stature. Let's give him a 4th star. And Roosevelt's response is, we'll give him a 4th star when he's done something to earn a 4th star. So FDR is not a fan of Eisenhower, to say the least. He's not a patron. But it's in this interaction, I think, that they have in the lead up to Cairo, where Roosevelt really does see Eisenhower's sort of full complement of talents for the first time. And a big part of that, which I was surprised by, but is fascinating, is Kay Summersby, who is the long-term rumored, let's just say love interest of Eisenhower in World War II. I think it's more complicated than that, but certainly the one thing that FDR knows about Eisenhower at a personal level is that he's supposedly having an affair with his British driver, Kay Summersby. And as soon as Roosevelt gets off the plane, he starts talking to Eisenhower about Kay Summersby. He's basically hazing the guy about Kay Summersby for over the course of 2 days. And Eisenhower never cracks, right? He always just flashes a smile and keeps his cool. And I think there was something in that interaction that let Roosevelt understand that this guy he has the political chops that it's going to take to make sure that the alliance between the United States and Great Britain doesn't splinter apart. Because one of the things that Roosevelt really begins to fear, genuinely fear, during the Cairo conferences is the splintering of the Atlantic Alliance, precisely because of these essentially altercations that George Marshall and the British chiefs are having with one another. Roosevelt even secretly says to his personal secretary back in Washington that he's becoming exhausted by playing referee. And he needs someone who can hold the alliance together at this most critical stage of the war. And I think as much as, again, I think all of the transparent reasons he doesn't want to lose Marshall are a big part of why he ends up picking Eisenhower instead. I think he ends up picking Eisenhower specifically instead because he understands that this is the one guy who can keep Britain and America together through this critical phase of the war.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies and Indiana-based public relations enterprise. Sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today, Michel Paradis. We're discussing his book. I'm trying my hardest, man.
No, you're doing spectacular. No one's.
Are you sure now? Are you sure?
Oh yeah.
All right. Punk me if I get it wrong.
No, it's all good.
We're discussing his book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. And I need to apologize because I conflated two conferences. The Devils Will Get No Rest is about the Casablanca conference, not the Cairo one. So you should still read it, though. I'll still connect you with James Conroy. It's really, I would
love that. Yeah,
it's a great podcast in case you want to listen to it, but it's an even better book. I'm going to ask about Kay later.
Oh, sure.
Summersby, because I definitely want to get into that. Excuse me for a little bit.
Can I actually answer one of your questions from before, too, about what made Ike so successful? Like, why was he as successful as he was? Because as you were doing the promos, I was reminded of his chief of staff, a guy named Bedell Smith, Walter Bedell Smith, who is a son of Indiana.
I was going to say, that's exactly right.
And he's one of those people in history who I think is unfortunately somewhat forgotten now, outside the people who are really interested in World War II, but is also a really interesting guy who goes from quitting high school, grows up in Indiana, quits high school to join the Indiana National Guard, and as a private, I think at the age of 16 or 17 at the time, and makes his way ultimately to 4-star general. Right. So he is someone who has the full run of an Army career. And his main way of doing that is by being Eisenhower's chief of staff throughout the war. People often said Eisenhower's hatchet man. He was the guy who could have the sort of uncomfortable conversations that Eisenhower shouldn't have.
Yeah, to your point, there's an interview, and forgive me, there's an interview with Richard Nixon, and it's on YouTube, and it discusses a conversation. Nixon discusses a conversation he had with Bedell Smith, and Smith looks at Nixon and goes, I was basically Ike's Pratt boy. Ike always had to have a Pratt boy. And Nixon goes, I had to do the same thing.
That's right. That's right.
I had to do all the unpleasant personnel or have the unpleasant conversations that Ike either didn't want to have or felt like as the commander in chief or a 5-star general that he shouldn't have.
That's right. And Nixon, a lot of Eisenhower, what fascinated me a little bit about that, is how much of the story, certainly the story I write about the lead up to D-Day, presages the presidency of Eisenhower, right? So many of the issues and leadership techniques that he ends up, really mastering in this period become essential to his time in the presidency. And Richard Nixon is his Bedell Smith in the presidency, right? He is, if everyone is going to Ike, he needs to have some grimacing son of a bitch who's willing to have the hard conversations that Eisenhower can't be the one to have. And it's not because, I want to emphasize too, because it can make Eisenhower seem duplicitous, and maybe it is a little bit. But Eisenhower was that guy too, right? Eisenhower, we think of Eisenhower as the big smiling Ike that he became. But for the years that I was talking about him learning the art of followership and cultivating all those mentors, he was known as those guys' hatchet men. Quite infamously, he ends up writing the report justifying Douglas MacArthur's provocation of the bonus army. That's Eisenhower. He knows that you need to, if you're going to be a successful leader, you need to have someone who can get the things that you can't be publicly seen as doing done. And Bedell Smith is just amazing at that job, right? They are They're never real buddies, which is interesting. Like they don't actually have the kind of friendship that Eisenhower has with lots of other folks, even at that time. But they are 100% simpatico in the way they think about leadership and operations that make them really indispensable to one another. So just speaking to that Indiana connection, I think Eisenhower, Beetle Smith is one of the unsung heroes of the Second World War.
Beetle doesn't come off well in the preeminent World War II biographical movie, meaning Patton comes off as a fighter and Smith comes off as a kind of a desk-bound paperclip rearranger. And that I'm guessing that's part of the reason why Smith doesn't really get his due. But we tend to romanticize the Grants, the Sheridans, the Shermans, Pattons over Truscotts, over people who are mere planners, that leads me right into my next question, because when I say mere planner, it is not an insult. And the great example number one of the importance of planning as we get to the actual D-Day invasion, landing craft. It's amazing. Every book, Craig Simons has a terrific book on the preparation for D-Day. Your book, there's so many, obviously the Ambrose books. Landing craft is really the alpha and omega of Operation Overlord. They can never get enough. The Navy doesn't want to share. You think about what's going on in France or in Europe, and then realize it's basically the United States fighting a completely different war against a completely different enemy, 10,000 miles away. There's all this competition for resources. And for D-Day, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's fair to say that the number and the type of landing craft available is what dictates so much of what happens, not only in the planning, but on the actual landing. True or false?
Oh, 100% true. There's a great line that Marshall says in his meetings with the Soviet command in the Tehran conference, which is basically smack dab in the middle of the Cairo conference in November, December of 1943. And he says, I'm an army man. Like prior to this war, I never thought about landing craft beyond a rubber boat. And now I think of little else. Because this is a world war. A world war is a war of logistics, fundamentally. It's a war of getting people to the fight. It's where you determine where even the fight is. And that was obviously true in spades in the Pacific, right? With the island hopping campaign, the Pacific is nothing but a series of archipelagos and atolls that you have to essentially move men across with landing craft. Hence the Navy's desire to hoard as many landing craft as they can for the Pacific War. But it's true in Europe as well, because certainly by the time the Germans expelled the British at the Battle of Dunkirk, Europe becomes the continent of Europe becomes a fortress. And you have the Soviets, obviously, on the Eastern Front with a battle line that runs thousands of miles with millions of men. But as far as the American and British allies are concerned, the Western allies are concerned, the only way into Europe is over the sea. And there are no bridges crossing the English Channel into France. And so landing craft really are as you say, the alpha and the omega of making any operation even possible. Because as much as the air forces, for example, thought they could win the war by bombing, at the end of the day, you need to get people into France. And the only way to do that is through landing craft, which in turn makes landing craft not only like practically incredibly important, but also makes them symbolically important in every debate, because where you allocate landing craft is where the high command, right, where the Joint Chiefs and the British chiefs, which together form the combined chiefs, it's where they're setting the priorities, right? So are they going to put more landing craft in the Pacific? Because that's the priority. Or are they going to do it in the Mediterranean? Or are they going to do it for Operation Overlord? So every debate about landing craft is ultimately a debate about the strategy of the war overall.
And it's fair to say that General Marshall and General Eisenhower, President Roosevelt, have a formidable adversary in the decisions on landing craft in Chief of Naval Operations Ernest King.
For sure.
They don't always get along, and King is one of the foremost, if not the foremost, advocate of, look, we don't have time to do Europe and the Pacific at the same time. Let's knock out the Pacific and then do the other. So he had the Japan first mindset, which made this allocation discussion even more difficult.
Oh, absolutely. And look, he had politics on his side too, right? We forget it now just because most of our historical, like, celebrated memories of World War II are all in Europe, or at least for the most part in Europe. But
Well,
at
yeah,
the
you
time,
because you can visit those. I was in Normandy 2 months ago, and you
oh
just
yeah,
sit
for
there.
the
Yeah,
yeah,
and no, just went on vacation, and you stand on land and walk through the concrete bunkers and stuff that's still standing, and then you look out in the. I guess I should, since you're on the podcast, I should call it La
yeah,
Manche.
yeah, that's right.
The French don't call it the English Channel; they call it the sleeve. Anyway, look out into the English Channel, and then you walk the beach to where the water starts to hit you, and then you turn around and then you look towards land, and you're like, you simply cannot be serious.
Yeah,
And so you can visit all those places, whereas I suppose you can visit Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal and Okinawa, Kwajalein, but how many people actually do? So your point's well
yeah,
taken. The memory of Europe, besides the cultural ties,
yeah,
is
yeah.
one that's reinforced by the fact that you can visit the Battle of the
Oh yeah.
Bulge.
And I also think too, this is not subject to the book, but I also think the Holocaust changed our understanding of World War
Great
II.
point.
Much as like we think of the Civil War as in the context of slavery today, right? That wasn't how people at the time thought about the Civil War, right? It was fine, but it was almost a divisive issue at the time of the Civil War. And I think the Holocaust certainly put a moral dimension to the victory in Europe that it just didn't have at the time, that we didn't see at the time. And so when Ernest King is saying we need to commit to a Pacific first strategy, he has Congress behind him, right? He has the American public behind him. And as I mentioned before, 1944 is an election year, and the Japanese are very dug in. We're making some progress in the Pacific, but so do the Japanese in certain parts of Asia, right? It's a much more touch and go war at that point. And so Ernest King not only has the sort of political wins behind him, but he, has a really good case to make. Look, we should be investing way more in our Pacific strategy, and Europe is a sinkhole. The Germans will eventually lose to the Soviets. What do we care? And that was a pretty common sentiment, actually, at the
Even
time.
though it went against the Germany first sort of resolution that Roosevelt and Churchill had.
Yep.
King does have enormous power, and the landing crafts are uh, spectacularly in demand. Let's talk
Yeah, and
for a
that's how
minute.
he exercises that power, right? Because that's Navy, right? He knows how many landing craft there are. He can control how many are built, where they're built, right? Are they built in San Francisco, or are they built in on the Atlantic coastal ports? He's a great, one of the things I try to develop in this book, and I hope people don't get too bored with it. But to me, it was fascinating, is like how is bureaucrat, like the politics of war,
Mm-hmm.
to put a fine point on it. That how things happen in history, how even wars unfold are often political, are resolved politically in the sense of like people are bureaucratic warriors. Like they know how to outmaneuver people in negotiation, in in how you make the government do things. And Ernest King was an absolute master of that, right? He knew how to do bureaucratic politics at least as well as George Marshall.
Talk a little bit, please, about how Eisenhower navigated the bureaucracy. You just mentioned it, and I don't want to get too much into process, but Eisenhower was able to, as you mentioned earlier, keep the alliance together while making people in DC happy, while making Churchill happy and humoring Churchill on more than one occasion. And while he is in the middle of this logistical hurricane to try to get folks from England, soldiers to Normandy, they decide pretty quickly, is it fair to say, that Calais is just not going to work?
Yeah, that's not never. Yeah, they do a feint towards Calais.
And that's the famous, is it Fortitude, Operation Fortitude? Is that with
Yeah,
Patton?
Operation Fortitude.
Because the
Yeah, yeah.
Germans thought Patton was going to lead everything. But take us through a typical day of Eisenhower's existence in the spring of 44 and everything he had to deal with.
Yeah, it's a very perceptive question. It was there's obviously been a lot written about D-Day, a lot written about even Eisenhower, and certainly World War II. And the thing I thought was missing, the thing that interested me and piqued my curiosity was like, what was that like, right? It's not, because when you read most history, certainly of the planning for D-Day, it tends to be very sort of discrete and segmented, right? There's a chapter on the negotiations over landing craft, chapter on the Air Forces, chapter on France, chapter on beach obstacles, that kind of stuff. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was preparing to do the book was that for Eisenhower, it's all at the same time, right? There are no chapters. And so the thing I did in trying to understand him in a new way was I actually got a hold of his day planners and daily diaries in the sense of who he met with on a given day, which had only really come to light about 20 years ago. And I systematically basically tried to figure out what he did every day, who he talked to every day, to feel almost like a fly on the wall. And so a lot of my efforts in this book is just trying to report to you what it was like to sit around and see Eisenhower go through all this stuff every day. And that meant like he'd wake up, he'd have a meeting with someone about the landing craft issues, which came to be known as the Battle of the Numbers, because everyone is, negotiating every single landing ship tank and landing craft infantry and every other variant on a landing craft down to the decimal point every day.
And Italy's happening at the same time, and they need.
Italy is a bottomless pit when it comes to resources, and it's and the British are way more invested in Italy than they are certainly in Operation Overlord. And so every argument over LSTs is really a proxy argument over who is really in control of Allied strategy, Britain or the United States. And then he would have to meet with someone from the Air Forces who didn't want to do a bombing run that he thought was essential to preparing the ground for D-Day. And then he'd have to meet with his judge advocate, who would bring to him essentially a list of all of the crimes committed by American service members, of 1.5 million service members in Britain over the previous week, that Eisenhower would have to essentially approve or disapprove the court-martial convictions of. He'd then have to meet with his intelligence chiefs about the most recent intercepts that the British had acquired from people like von Rundstedt and Rommel on the other side, showing that they were actually adding more fortifications to the Normandy beaches. And then occasionally he would get meetings, one of which I found utterly fascinating because I'd never heard about it until I went through this process, was at one point Marshall says, hey, you have to meet with this major, this army major who he sends over. And it's a Saturday afternoon, right? A major is a pretty low-ranking officer for Eisenhower to be meeting with at this point in his career. But he's sent over by Marshall, and Marshall says you have to meet with him alone. And so Eisenhower basically, bookends him at the end of the day on Saturday, probably hoping to get out for a ride or something. And the major sits down and says, basically, hi, I'm from the Manhattan Project. The Nazis might have nuclear weapons, and there's nothing you can do to stop them if they have them. We think there's maybe a 10% chance that they'll use them, and you can't really tell anybody that we've told you this, but just FYI, right? And this is like a month out from D-Day itself, where Eisenhower just has to absorb the idea that he could be facing this terrifying new weapon on the other side of the beaches.
Along with the threat of poison gas, which they obviously everybody used in the Great War, but aside from I think Zyklon B in the concentration camps, it wasn't used on the battlefield during World War II. But if you're gonna demand unconditional surrender, then you're laying the foundation for unconditional warfare.
That's right.
Talk for a few minutes, please, about the subordinates, the people that Eisenhower had to deal with, because you mentioned earlier, it's Beadle Smith, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, all of these British air marshals and admirals, 4-star admirals and above, plus our own Tyree Eaker and all the other folks who are saying, as you mentioned, just let us bomb them until they can't take it any longer. How did Eisenhower balance listening to their advice without being run over by them?
Mostly by smoking. He gets up to 3 packs a day by the time D-Day is launched. But you're entirely right. We think, certainly in the sort of warm glow of nostalgia and retrospect, we think of everyone pulling in the same direction. Everyone's pointing towards D-Day. But we forget that, every organization, not just every military organization, is a political organization. And people have their own agendas, their own views about how best to win the war, right? It's not bad faith. It's just they have really different ideas, particularly in the context of the air forces. And you have, again, this international rivalry between the British and the Americans unspooling at the same time there as well, right? Where you have the British and the American navies, very much at loggerheads with one another, right? Deeply. Admiral Kirk, who's the head of the American naval contingent for Operation Neptune and Operation Overlord, does not get along with his British counterparts. And Eisenhower is essentially put in the uncomfortable position of constantly mediating between American and British commanders of not only the air forces, but the naval forces and even the armies, because everyone has their own way of doing things. And he's having to reconcile those. A lot of Eisenhower's leadership strategy is, in terms of dealing with subordinates, is a combination of two things, I think, which is really remarkable from a human patience side. One is that he really does listen to everybody. He has the humility that a real true leader has of never really believing that they're 100% right. And he learned that over his career in terms of really listening to, and almost especially listening to the viewpoints of people he dislikes, because they're going to probably say things that are otherwise going to be discounted, or if he's surrounded by yes men, he's not going to hear. But at the same time, being willing to make a decision that is maybe wrong, right? And this is one of, I think, the fascinating and almost most admirable aspects of his leadership skill set is he understands that his job is not to be right all the time. It's his job to make the best decisions he can. And so that makes it in some ways, maybe not for his blood pressure, but in some ways easier to hear lots of competing advice, because if you're only focused on getting the job done, if you're only focused on what is the best decision I can make, it almost disciplines your mind to not care about who's giving you that information. And his patience, his human patience is astronomical and incredibly impressive. And I say that particularly as the father of young children, like his ability to just deal with people.
But he was known for having a famously explosive temper.
He did. Oh my God. Yeah.
One of my favorite stories is when he sends an American officer home because the American officer had gotten into an argument with some British officer. And Eisenhower says, I'm not sending you back to the I'm not sending you home because you called him a son of a bitch. I'm sending you home because you called him a British son of a bitch.
That's right. Yeah. But that's exactly what I mean, right? He's doing everything he can to keep his mind clear and focus on the important things. And to him, one of the most important things from the very beginning of the war is maintaining that Anglo-American alliance, like keeping people pulling in the same direction, because he understands that those points of friction are everywhere. Cultural, just political personality, prestige, arrogance, ego, right? You don't get to be the top admiral, top general, top airman in your country's respective service by being a shrinking violet. And so he understands, he is able to manage people with astronomically large egos, probably better than almost anybody I've ever seen.
And the British certainly aren't used to being told what to do with their navy.
For sure. Not the least by an American.
No, even though I'm sure more than one person brought up the Battle of Lake Erie while they were over there. We have a few more minutes with Michel Paradis. He has written the book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower D-Day and the Birth of an American Superpower. Eisenhower seemed to disdain distractions, but he had a pretty big one over there. And his name was George Patton. How did he? I'd love to see a book that's just about the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton. I would read it like crazy.
Yeah.
How did he manage the Patton distraction?
I think he did a couple of things. I think a couple of things are going on actually in the relationship, some of which are more admirable probably than others.
He took the long view for sure.
For sure. Yeah. And that is the most admirable thing, right? Like he understood that Patton had unique value to him, not the least because the Germans were terrified of Patton. And he understood that the Germans paid so much attention to Patton, much like the Americans and the British paid attention to Rommel, that anywhere Patton was, the Germans would anticipate was the Allies' next move. And so Eisenhower used that to extraordinarily good effect in the most famous feint in history, which is Operation Fortitude, which was the Allies' phony invasion of Calais, which is a peninsula a few hundred miles east of Normandy. That's actually the closest point between Britain and France, and that the Germans thought, for very good reason, it would be the most logical place to land the Allied operation. And so they set up an entire army group, the first U.S. Army group, that was headed by George S. Patton, that was entirely fictional, or it was made up of real components, but it had entirely fictional components, an entirely fictional naval contingent. And he did that because he knew that as long as the Germans were looking at where George Patton was, he could send Omar Bradley across the English Channel. So he understood that Patton had just, if nothing else, a psychological effect that he could not achieve with any of his other commanders. He also knew Patton was a genius for the battlefield, right? Patton was someone who studied history with as much, if even more enthusiasm than Eisenhower did, and just had that sense of the battlefield in his bones, which gave him the ability to act with incredible initiative when it mattered, whether or not it was in Sicily, but ultimately even in the Battle of the Bulge, right? Patton was the guy who Eisenhower knew he would need to put essentially enough punch into the battle in order to keep the initiative from slipping from them. But there's also a personal dimension to it, which I try to develop somewhat in the book, is that they're old friends. They're some of the old, Patton is one of Eisenhower's oldest genuine friends. They get together when Eisenhower's in his late 20s. They serve together in what is now Fort Meade as some of the earliest advocates of the tank when that was not consistent with Army doctrine. But Patton and Eisenhower both were big tank guys. And so they were very old friends who had done favors for each other basically their entire career.
I looked up to him, is it fair to say, is like a big older brother, but
yeah.
And then movie Patton that won the Oscar Academy Award and all that, Eisenhower doesn't even appear in it. His name does, but it's spoken, but it's not said. I think and I wonder if that was actually Francis Ford Coppola won the Oscar for that screenplay. So I would love to ask him, why did you not write Eisenhower into it? Because clearly Eisenhower looked up to Patton, realized he had qualities that Ike didn't have.
Yeah.
And Patton, I get the sense, although there are times where he writes disparagingly of Eisenhower, he understands that as much as Eisenhower needs Patton, Patton needs Eisenhower. And that comes out really strongly in your book.
Yeah, they need each other for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, they definitely need each other. And I think Patton understands that. Patton is he's a great character to write about. That's why there's so many great books about him, to be honest, or even a great movie about him. And because he is such a volatile character, right? You always know what he's thinking. Whereas Eisenhower is very difficult, right? He's actually very difficult to write about because he's a poker player, right? He doesn't let you know what he's thinking unless he wants you to know what he's thinking. And so
he's constantly mad because he always knows what Patton is thinking.
And he always knows, right? He always knows that something's.
Why won't he just shut up?
That's right. And always the most inopportune times too. Like that was one of the fun things in the book, right? The major blowups with Patton happen at times when Eisenhower is like barely hanging by a thread anywhere. Yeah. It's like a really important decision point, and then all of a sudden, like Patton explodes. And so, it's a great relationship. It's one of those great sort of heat and light pairings that I don't know that but certainly the American effort in World War II, I don't think certainly could have been as successful as it was without the pairing of those two guys.
One other person, we mentioned the importance of the landing craft, but for at least a few weeks, if not more, the most important person in Great Britain, as it relates to the invasion, is the weatherman.
Yeah, James Martin Stagg. Yeah. Yeah, it's that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just you do a terrific job of taking us through in your book. Taking us through how everyone is on pins and needles because was he a light colonel, I think, but he comes in and he's got all these 3 stars, 4 stars, field marshals and all that hanging on his every word.
Yeah.
This is the weatherman.
Yeah. He's basically after Eisenhower comes to London in early 44, in January 44 to lead D-Day, he finds that the weather predictions, like the system they have in place for weather prediction is just a mess, right? Everyone has their own weatherman. The Army has theirs, the British have theirs, the Navy has theirs, the Air Forces have theirs. And Eisenhower knows, both from history and personal experience, that the weather is a terrain. You got to know the weather as best as you can for all sorts of planning purposes, and especially in an amphibious invasion. And so decides to consolidate the meteorological services and basically gets this Scottish meteorologist, stuffs him into a uniform, and basically says, you're now essentially the general for weather. And makes him such, right? He takes him to all of the command conferences. He basically treats him more or less the equivalent of his air chief and his naval chiefs, and makes him each week at the command conference predict that week's weather. And then they review his prediction the following week, right? Which is, if you've ever lived in England, like that's pretty hard to do on an hour by hour basis. And James Martin Stagg is doing it. But what Eisenhower is doing there, and again, this is like a real tip for leadership and just an insight in how sharp his mind is. It's not just putting pressure on Stagg to get good at this, which is part of it. He's also learning Stagg, right? When Stagg comes in and says this, that, and the other thing, right? We think we're going to have rain and that's going to be sunny, et cetera. Like Eisenhower is learning how to read him like a poker player. And that obviously becomes incredibly important as you're leading up to the invasion when Stagg comes to him and says, if you launch on June 5th, as they originally planned to do, it's going to be a disaster. There's basically about something akin to a hurricane is about to blow through, and you won't be able to use the air forces. The landing craft, the ones that arrive, will be full of seasick men, and the gunships from the Navy won't be able to see because there'll be zero visibility. And Eisenhower, when he gets that prediction from Stagg to delay the operation, and he ends up having to overrule some of his commanders, including Bernard Montgomery, to delay the invasion by a day, which is a massive risk. He does it not because he's quote unquote trusting the science, so to speak, right? It's not just, oh, my meteorologist told me this, I have to follow it. It's that he knows that he can trust that judgment. He's learned his meteorologist so that he can understand that when he's told about the risks, that he can take those risks seriously without just abdicating his responsibility as the commander to really know what's going on. And the same thing's true the following day when Stagg comes back and says, based on what could only be described as a bit of meteorological hocus pocus, there's actually going to be a 48-hour break in the weather starting on June 6th. When you're looking out the window, right, and it's pouring down rain, the wind is tearing the shingles off the house, Eisenhower can say, okay, let's go in the middle of the night on reliance on not his gut, because his gut was probably saying, stay indoors, but based on the fact that he had cultivated this relationship with Stagg so that he understood that he could trust his advice fundamentally.
Let's end the Leaders and Legends podcast, this part of it, on a brief discussion, and you make it the last little chapter. That's not the right term, but part of your book. The relationship between Eisenhower and Kay Summersby, his British driver. It's been explored multiple times. Harry Truman's stories about it have been mostly, I think, discounted.
Yeah.
You do so in your book. And there were people who said, look, let Ike do what he wants. If she's helping us win the war, then who cares? That's none of our business. What's your conclusion on the relationship, the nature of the relationship between Kay Summersby and Dwight Eisenhower?
I think everyone's, are they having a sexual relationship? And the thing where I come down, and it's not a cop-out, I promise, is it's none of my business, right? And it feels weird to think about getting in Eisenhower's underwear drawer, so to speak. But what I do think is actually really interesting and important about the relationship, and this is where I try to write it up, because frankly, I don't think we'll ever really know what kind of, sexual relationship or not, or romantic relationship they ever had, because they're both dead, and they were careful enough about how they talked about it that we have no credible confirmation of its nature, really. But we do know it was an incredibly intimate relationship at a time when Eisenhower was away from Mamie Eisenhower with a brief exception that's covered in the book, basically 4 years. He's incredibly lonely. He's under incredible amounts of pressure at all times, and he has really no home to go to. And if nothing else, she did serve the role of kind of the ersatz wife, of someone he could trust, of someone who he didn't have to worry about. And I think the fact that she was a woman made that easier, because even Harry Butcher, who's his close confidant and buddy throughout the war, and Eisenhower puts him in charge of writing their daily diaries down. When it looks like Eisenhower is going to be sent off to the Pentagon, Harry Butcher starts looking for a new job too, right? So there is this certain, even the most loyal people in his circle aren't that loyal, except for Kay. And so he trusts her, and he's able to, I think, just, and that's incredibly important for, I think, anyone in that kind of leadership position, given how difficult and stressful and exhausting and lonely fundamentally it is to have that kind of person. And I think, unfortunately, from a historical perspective, there's been so much interest in what kind of sexual relationship, if any, they had, that people have, I think, underestimated that aspect. What I think is actually probably the more important aspect, which is that she was this confidant to him, and how that's really important, because these are just people, right? These are human beings in these incredibly intense, high stress, uncertain situations. And when we look back at them as like marble statues, I think we actually do them a disservice, because they got up every day and they had to shake off drinking too much the night before and try to keep their head clear and try to keep in the game. And that's really what, to me, is remarkable about someone like Eisenhower, is just the onslaught of challenges that he dealt with and just kept his head together. Much like that Rudyard Kipling poem, when everyone is losing their heads all about you and blaming you, and you can keep yours. That's Eisenhower. And I think Kay Summersby is an essential part of that, because it kept him human, and it gave him a place to be safe and to be comfortable when there was no other safe port in the storm, so to speak.
He can only get so close to Americans, right? Because he is the commander in chief, and he's not going to have a So the fact that she was British, she was
Yep.
obviously attractive. Her husband had just been killed. Her fiance had just been killed. She was seen all the time with him. To me, the question of whether they actually consummated their relationship is, I wouldn't want to be in the room with it, but it wouldn't, like, if
Wouldn't
someone
surprise
said,
me.
yeah, but if someone said, absolutely, here's proof it did happen, I'm like, man, the dude's managing the fate of the free world. If he can't
Yeah.
take it any longer, he can't take it any longer. I not,
Yeah.
but once he left,
he's defeating the actual Hitler, right?
yeah.
Like,
And then he leaves he leaves to go back to the United States, and it's over.
yeah, it is.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Are you ready, sir?
I'll try to be.
What was your first job?
I was a paper boy for the Allentown Morning Call.
What was your first concert? Please say it's Billy Joel.
I was U2, actually, the Octung Baby Tour. They played Vet Stadium in Philadelphia, and my mom took me.
That's not bad at all.
Yeah, it was great. I still remember it.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh, there's so many. I guess it would depend on the purpose, but I'll just default to probably one of my favorite books, because I go back to it all a lot, is The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe, because it's just beautifully written. It's just such an interesting exploration of these heroic figures, but just as people, much of like we were just talking about, with such just keen understanding. It's certainly the best thing he wrote. I like him a lot, but it's bar none in terms of his work. And I go back to it a lot because it's just such an easy read. You can drink it down in a day if you want to.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, that's a really good one. What would be the singular event? There's so many. You're asking a historian that, so that's like every book you write is trying to get yourself in those moments. This is probably a overused one, but I think it would be fascinating, is the crucifixion of Jesus, because it's a moment that's so wrapped up in legend that it would be fascinating to just see how it actually happened, what people were actually.
The crucifixion as opposed to the resurrection.
Yeah, the crucifixion, because everyone, much like D-Day, everyone's a fan once it goes off well. But the beforehand, when things are at their bleakest, how many Thomases were there, so to speak? How many Judases were there? I bet there were more than we know or think about or certainly took credit for after the fact.
It's like D-Day. I feel badly that I didn't ask you more questions about the actual day, but there's so much that leads up to it that's equally fascinating. And you could do, obviously, a podcast, a palooza about the day itself.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
Off the record, that's a great one. Who would be... There are a lot of them that are jumping in mind, but I think in terms of... I'd be actually fascinated to sit down and have a 2-hour dinner with George W. Bush, the former president. Because
history buff without parallel. He's a nut.
Big reader, big history buff, and like Eisenhower. And this is one of the things that I think fascinated me most about Eisenhower is he's one of those people whose war being underestimated as like their biggest, most lethal weapon. And people misunderestimate me, I believe, is George W. Bush's great quote. And there's just a lot more going on there than he ever publicly advertised that I think would make him a fascinating person to have dinner with, just to talk to him about all the various events in which he was involved, assuming that dinner meant he would be candid with me about all those things.
That's why I had off the record to the question, that you can sit there and ask.
Yeah.
Any
question. If I gave him like a
want.
truth serum or something, I'd be fascinated. I'd be fascinated to talk to him for a couple of hours.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, who landed in North Africa in 1942.
Very cool.
Our guest today has been Michel Paradis. I'm getting more French, right, as we go
You
along.
are. I feel like
or
I should
less.
Have a baguette. I should be eating a baguette or something right now.
more French, more ridiculous. You tell me which.
That's right. I grew up in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, so no one ever pronounced my name that way when I was growing up. But
been discussing his terrific book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. It is a terrific read. It's a wonderful read. Thank you so much for for responding to my email out of the blue and coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast. I'd love to have you on again someday.
I would love that. This was a great conversation.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.